Hey everyone, and welcome. Ready to put your knowledge of the Indian Constitution to the test? We're going to do things a little differently today. Think of this as a pop quiz explainer, where we break down some of its most crucial principles. Let's dive right in. So why do people call Part 3 of our Constitution the Magna Carta of India? Well, did you know it's because Part 3 is where our fundamental rights are guaranteed? Basically, these rights are a huge check on the power of the state. They protect individual liberty, just like the original Magna Carta put limits on the king's power way back when. First up, we're diving into the Citizen's Playbook. This is all about that fundamental relationship between what you're entitled to, your rights, and what's expected of you, your duties. So, what is the real relationship between rights and duties in India? Well, according to the Constitution, they're two sides of the same coin. They're correlative. What that really means is that the rights you get to enjoy come with some responsibilities, some duties. It's all about creating that perfect balance between your personal freedom and our collective social responsibility. Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. It's the difference in enforcement. Your rights, those are legal claims. You can literally go to court and demand them from the state. But duties, well, they're a bit different. They're more like our moral and civic obligations, stuff like respecting the flag. They're not something you can be taken to court for, but they're seen as absolutely essential for keeping our democracy strong. All right, pop quiz time again. How many fundamental duties were first added to the Constitution back in 1976? So, did you know that initially there were 10? This was a pretty big deal at the time. It was a major step to really spell out the civic obligations of every citizen, and they even added a whole new section, Part 4A, just for them. But as you can see, the story doesn't end there. The count didn't stop at 10. In 2002, they added an 11th duty, and this one was so important. It made it a fundamental duty for parents or guardians to make sure their kids, between the ages of 6 and 14, get a chance at an education. Okay, let's think about a real-world scenario. If a female officer in the armed forces gets denied a promotion just because she's a woman, which fundamental right is being violated? Well, that is a textbook violation of the right to equality. Article 14 of the Constitution is super clear on this. It guarantees equality before the law and flat out prohibits discrimination based on religion, race, caste, sex, or where you were born. All right, let's switch things up. We've just covered the Citizen's Playbook. Now, let's flip it and look at the government's rulebook. We're talking about the state's guiding principles. So, what are these things? The Directive Principles of State Policy, or DSPS for short. The key thing to get here is that they aren't just polite suggestions. Think of them as the conscience of the Constitution, a moral compass for lawmakers. Now, here's the catch. Unlike your fundamental rights, you can't sue the government to enforce them. But, and this is a big but, they're considered absolutely fundamental to how the country should be run. So where did these big ideas come from? What were the sources for India's directive principles? Well, did you know that the framers of our Constitution were inspired by several sources? Most famously, the Irish Constitution. It just goes to show you they were looking at best practices from all over the world to build a guide for India's future. And this right here really shows that amazing blend of influences. You've got the Government of India Act of 1935, which gave the basic administrative structure. Then there's the Irish Constitution, which brought in those ideas of social justice. And finally, the Sapru Report, which was crucial because it stressed the need for two kinds of rights, those you can enforce in court and those that act as guiding principles. Okay, now for a really critical, and let's be honest, often debated topic. What happens when the nation hits a major crisis? Let's get into the emergency powers laid out in the Constitution. Okay, here's a tough one. Which article did Dr. B.R. Ambedkar himself defend, saying it should only be used as a matter of last resort? The answer, it's Article 356, the one that allows for president's rule in a state. Now, Dr. Ambedkar was fully aware it could be misused, but he argued it was a necessary safety valve to protect the Constitution if a state government completely breaks down. And this quote really says it all, doesn't it? The people who wrote the Constitution saw this not as some political chess move, but as an extreme measure for the absolute worst-case scenarios, something to be used with incredible caution. All right, let's talk money. What kind of approval does a financial emergency need in Parliament? You might be surprised to learn that it only requires a simple majority. That just means more than 50% of the members who are present and voting. And here's the kicker. Once it's approved, it can stay in effect indefinitely until the president decides to revoke it. This table makes the differences really clear. Take a look. You'll notice that a national emergency under Article 352 needs that much tougher special majority. And there's a good reason for that higher bar. It's because a national emergency has a way bigger impact on the country's structure and on our rights as citizens.
All right, for our final section, let's get to the very heart of it all. We're going to look at the core philosophies that hold the entire constitutional framework together, the very bedrock of the Indian state.
So, we hear this phrase a lot, but what exactly is the rule of law in the Indian context? To put it simply, it means the law is king. The law is supreme, and it applies to absolutely everyone, citizens, politicians, even the government itself. This is the principle that guarantees no one is above the law, and it's a true cornerstone of our democracy. Okay, history buffs. Which landmark Supreme Court case established that the harmony between fundamental rights and directive principles is a non-negotiable part of the Constitution's basic structure? That would be the famous Minerva Mills case from 1980. The court came up with this brilliant analogy, ruling that fundamental rights and directive principles are like the two wheels of a chariot. You can't say one is more important than the other. They need to work in balance. And this timeline here shows you what a fascinating journey this has been in the courts. At first, back in the day, the courts clearly favored fundamental rights over the directive principles. But over the years, the thinking evolved, leading up to that Minerva Mills case where the Supreme Court finally said, hey, for this to work, you need both. Harmony and balance are key. And we're going to wrap up with a final big picture question for you to chew on. Are rights gifts that the state gives you, or are they limitations that you place on the state? The Constitution leans heavily towards the second idea, that your rights are inherent. They exist to make sure the state doesn't overstep, to protect individual life and liberty. That's a really powerful thought to end on. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.